And you see the global macro shifts as well, right? Manufacturing, in terms of manufacturing, moving from China to India and the China plus one strategy, right? So if, let's say, you want to start off again in some, not now purchase, but let's say some other segment in the B2B space, where would you start and where would you look at?
So I think this was an interesting question when you
Yeah.
just asked me before we started the recording.
Hi, I'm Saharsh. I look at consumer and B2B investments here at Orias. I have with me Naman. Naman is the founder of Now Purchase. Now Purchase is a metal procurement platform for metal fabricators and manufacturers. We partnered with Naman back in late 2021, I think.
That's right.
Yeah. So, and they're trying to solve for a massive $140 billion industry. So, Naman, why don't you give a brief about yourself and about the industry?
Sure. Firstly, thanks for having us here. It's been a pleasure and honor to partner with Orias since our first raise in November 21. So Now Purchase is a metal procurement solution for the metal manufacturing industry. And our entire approach is based on two key tenets. One is being a full stack solution, and the other to see how we can marry the procurement and the production process. In terms of myself, I'm born and brought up in Calcutta, did my schooling there. Post that, spent 7 years overseas, primarily in Singapore and East Coast. Initially for my studies at NUS and UPenn, and then working for a couple of early stage startups in the edtech and fintech domain.
Oh, that's great. And can you give us a split? I think the industry is, it's a massive industry, of course. The industry is split between, a lot of it is iron and steel, and a lot of it is split between small-time fabricators. And why don't you shed some light on that?
Sure. So let's just understand what do you mean by metal manufacturers, right? So the way we look at it is that any guy who has a furnace and mixing a bunch of raw materials to make any kind of metal, whether it's iron, steel, zinc, copper, aluminium, would qualify as a metal manufacturer.
Right.
And given it's a large industry, a good chunk of it is iron and steel. So of the 140 billion you were mentioning, almost 120 billion would be iron and steel, and 25 billion would be non-ferrous, of course, which aluminium is the key. So that is the broad split in the industry. And one more thing to look at it is when typically we think of iron and steel, we think of the Tatas and the Jindals and the JSWs of the world. Of course, they are a large key aspect of this industry, but they make up anywhere between 40 to 45% of the industry. The rest, 50 to 60% of the industry, is actually made out of small and mid-sized players who are spread across the country. And these are sizable players, might not be as well known as a Tata or a Jindal, but they are doing significant business, and that is where primary Now Purchase focuses on.
Right. Thanks for that. So the metals industry, right, as everyone sees it, has existed for a very long time, right? And let's say the procurement costs are about, let's say, 50% of the overall TAM.
Correct.
So it projects to be a 70 billion industry, right? So, but it has existed for a long time with a lot of supply chain already solved for. And so why now? Why has it not been already disrupted by tech already?
Sure. So firstly, let's forget about the metal side and just look at how tech moves, right? That's at least my belief, is that tech starts from consumers, then slowly moves towards organized businesses, and then to unorganized businesses. Same with India, right? It started with the revolution around e-commerce, the OTAs, the aggregators, and then it went to fintech, which is a more organized of the B2B side, the banks. And then now it's starting to move into the unorganized space, which metal manufacturers, textiles, construction, all are a part of. So I think this is like a regular transition of how tech sort of disperses around the industry. That is one aspect, the way we think about it. The second is, on a macro level, India is going through massive development we see all around us. So the infrastructure development as one, the entire feeling and sentiment around the world that it's a China plus one where people are looking at India for sourcing. These two are very big, I would say macro factors which are sort of catalyzing this growth. And thirdly is that this entire industry is come to a place where people are realizing that they want to sort of make things more organized, because as the businesses have transitioned from one generation to the other, they are also not wanting to deal with everything by hand. They also want something more system generated and system oriented, because that's what now they have been used to in their life on a personal level. So when they come and join their business, they also want things more organized. So that is how we think of why this is a good time to build in such a fragmented and unstructured space of raw materials in the metal manufacturing.
Right. So just to build on that, can you give us as to what kind of problems you were able to identify in this space of foundries, right? And then how is Now Purchase trying to address all of them?
Sure. So foundries, is a subset of the metal manufacturing space, and it was our starting point and the first micro market we identified. And post that, now we have transitioned to service the mid-sized steel players as well. In terms of this entire space, we saw two, three things. One is that there was still some amount of pricing opaqueness, in the sense that people would be calling up each other and figuring out what's the price, and they would sometimes get different answers from different sources. So how can we put pricing to be something which is very transparent and at the core of it? That was one.
Real-time pricing.
Real-time pricing. So, we have a WhatsApp bot, a web app where people can see prices anytime there's a change. So there's no, people are not trying to, make money on information asymmetry. So earlier, someone would be like, okay, I know the price is going to increase tomorrow, but this guy does not know it yet. So can I make money of it? Right. So all that information asymmetry is sort of taken care of through our WhatsApp bot as well as our web app. Right. So that is one aspect. Second aspect is, so one of, our core raw materials is metal scrap. Now, whether you have seen it or not, the word scrap itself tells you that it's not something which is, it's not useful for the world thinks of it, but for the foundries and the steel guys, it's gold, right? It is a very, very key raw material. And typically, how do you make sure that, you're getting metal scrap of the same type? It's a very, very challenging problem. And how can we give a quality assurance layer for a product like metal scrap? So that was the second very key problem we looked at. And thirdly, people are using these raw materials to make something, right? It's a melting process, taking a bunch of raw materials to make another metal alloy. And we realized that this process of mixing these raw materials in a particular proportion was not very scientific. Leave aside IoT or Industry 4.0, there was not much done here for over decades. And that's where we felt a technology angle could add real value. So those were 2-3 insights which sort of, over time got built, and we sort of built solutions for each of them. And that sort of became how Now Purchase looks like today.
Right. So basically the opaque pricing bit, the fragmented supply with non-standardized quality, and basically the tech component or the software component of it, which you're providing through, I think that's Metal Cloud, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more. I think VCs have this, and every good investor wants to look at moats and competitive advantages that any startup or business has, right? And Metal Cloud, as we think, is one of them. Why don't you give us a brief about what Metal Cloud exactly is?
Sure. So, earlier B2B commerce, people were thinking about, giving delivery updates, pricing updates. But over a period of time, that has become commoditized. Even the brick and mortar guys are doing this because there are a lot of no-code solutions out there now. And while we also do that, we believe the angle of tech has to be something more deeper and more valuable to our customer, the factory owner. And that's where Metal Cloud comes in. So Metal Cloud is an IoT-enabled raw material melting solution, which gives the factories insights on how they could melt these raw materials better, how they could produce the end metal in a cheaper and more consistent manner. So there are 2-3 modules now in the Metal Cloud solution. One of them actually is almost like a recipe generator. So it almost tells you what is the best recipe to make a particular metal. So that is one. Second is, a module where we integrate with IoT devices at your factory to give you real-time analytics. So those are 2 key layers which we have built, and we are getting quite a good traction now on this. I think it's a little over 120 factories now on this. Over actually 3/4 of them actually now pay for it. So it's become a solution which earlier was just a good to have, but when we started opening up this for people to actually pay for, it became a very strong validation that it's not just a good to have. Factories are really valuing it like, a part of their operating system, which they go in and see every day to actually run their factory.
Right. So interesting. So basically on the first layer, you're trying to solve for their cost, where you're optimizing for pricing there. And the second is you're giving them good quality of supply, right, where the supply was fragmented. And the third is you're trying to make their operations more efficient. Right? So it's a full stack solution that you're providing to them. That's interesting. Again, I want to touch upon one more piece which you said, metal scrap, right? So, and that's one part of it. And the other part of it is also that the industry, the metal manufacturing industry generally in itself is seen as very negatively impacting the environment, right? How is Now Purchase sort of helping improve that sentiment?
Of course. So, it's we all know it. We all deal with it about things like global warming and stuff like that. And it's come really to the forefront. And metals, mining, these are some of the most polluting industries out there. And what people have started realizing is that there are ways to sort of still manufacture steel and metals in a way which is more greener. So at the core of this entire thing lies metal scrap, because just some numbers to give you a sense. If someone's using a ton of metal scrap, they're actually saving a little over 1100 kgs of iron ore and a little over 600 kgs of coking coal. So now you can imagine almost 1700, 1800 kgs of sort of polluting raw materials are being saved by using a ton or 1000 kgs of metal scrap. And hence, at Now Purchase, we are very much focused on promoting the use of metal scrap and actually seeing how metal scrap can even replace some of these legacy raw materials like sponge iron and all. Because at the end of the day, if you get good quality, assured metal scrap at your doorstep, at your factory, people are happy to make that switch. So that is one aspect which we are focusing on, and even globally, there's a huge narrative around ESG compliance. Europe has put in a mandate, something called CBAM, which means that every Indian metal exporter needs to do a CBAM certification, which basically tells them how much carbon, what was the carbon footprint for each supply. So it's not no longer a good to have, but soon it's becoming a place where people would have to sort of take adequate measures in terms of manufacturing better or green steel, if I may say.
Right, that's quite interesting. Now, switching gears, coming to the core business part of it, the B2B, since you are in the B2B space, right? So, multiple successful businesses in India have been built, right, in the B2B space. But the core lies in what investors and maybe founders as well look at is two core aspects, right? One is margins and how to grow them, and second is how to efficiently manage working capital, right? So, how have you managed all of this?
Sure. So I was hearing a very different founder in a different space. I was hearing Adit from Zepto talking about how even in the quick commerce space, it's about iterating every day and sort of adding up to the 5 basis points, 10 basis points in terms of margins. So at the outset, it's the same thing, right? The margins won't suddenly grow from 5 to 10% or 8 to 10%. It is an inch by inch figuring out all the different levers you have, right from sourcing to aggregation to branding to private labels. So I think it's a combination of efforts.
Right.
We have been leveraging all of these fronts. Recently, we have launched 3 SKUs in our own private labels, and we plan to launch another 5 in the coming 6 months. So that would create sort of a private label portfolio where we are consistently seeing double-digit margins for us. So that's one aspect. But in general, if someone's thinking of or scaling up in the B2B space, margin growth is inch by inch, month on month, day on day, and just making sure you're aligning that as your North Star metric, not a gross revenue, because in the B2B space you could scale up to 50, 100 crores monthly, and if you do that as the compromise of margins and working capital, eventually all of these businesses would have to IPO, and that looks like the most obvious and valuable exit for the company, the founder, the investors, everyone. And on that front, you have to keep margins at the core of it. So that's how we think of the margin game. Of course, B2B trade historically has been working capital heavy, and even for us, working capital is a key component. But we have been very clear that we're not going to get business because of extending working capital.
Right.
So you could give discounts like B2C players give discounts,
Right,
and attract business. And similarly in B2B, if you extend more working capital, you can easily attract business. But is that a right thing to do? So we are, dead against it, and we have never done it, and we are very strongly aligned with our entire team that that's not a route we want to go after. So what we do in terms of, managing our working capital is look at again a few components. One is, in working capital, there are typically 2 parts. One is what is the risk, and what is the cash flow liquidity. So,
right.
so people think of working capital as just liquidity, but there's risk and cash flow liquidity.
Correct.
So we think of whenever we are looking at a customer or a vendor, we're looking at which bucket they fall under. Is it a credit risk issue or is it a liquidity issue? And if it's a liquidity issue, then there's a different way to address it through some on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet programs with fintechs. If it's a risk issue, then there's very strong measures in terms of internal credit controls, the credit checks, working with some third-party bureaus to figure out, is this a credible customer? So that way, we have been able to, keep our both these numbers in a very good space where margins are closing in on double digits, the working capital days are sub 30, and that's been historically consistent. And that's something we pride ourselves upon, because eventually these businesses, if they can keep these two levers in check, they would become really, really high ROCE businesses. And return on capital would become, 30%, 25 to 30%. And if you open up the public companies, you'll see a less than, I think 6 to 7% of companies in India return ROCE over 25%, which I feel these businesses have the potential to do if you can, keep the margin and capital levers in check from the word go.
Right. So you have been growing well, right? And investors look at margins and working capital as we talked about, right? So just shed some light on how your fundraise journey has been so far.
Sure. So, Now Purchase initially started with some funds, some bootstrap funds from myself, Akash, and our family business, NIFA. And post that, in November 21 is when we had our first institutional raise led by Orias with the participation from InfoEdge and a bunch of family offices. Post that, we have been fortunate to be able to get more equity partners along with our existing folks, as well as get a lot of interesting working capital and debt partners as well. So that's pretty much been the journey over a period of time. I think we have raised over 50 crores in equity capital and an equal amount in debt as well.
So just again switching gears to what have been the challenges that you have faced so far in your journey, right? We can try to divide it in three parts, right? One would be at a company level, what have you faced? What are the macro challenges that you're facing, right? And maybe at a personal level, what challenges you face?
I think if I look at, before the pivot, I think one of the things was figuring out what is actually, everyone talks about product market fit a lot. And there's sometimes you as an entrepreneur take too long to, pull the plug at things.
Yeah.
So we spent a couple of years and we realized that in India, the horizontal play would not work unless people can deploy huge amount of technology and go deep. And that's what happened. Like a bunch of players sort of pivoted out from that horizontal MRO space. And that sort of is back to the core tenant, which at least I realized is that, people in India are not wanting to still pay money to save time. So the paisa time ratio is still a big question mark.
Yeah.
Recently some of these large Swiggy, Zomato increased their convenience fee, I think to $6 or $8. Yeah. I don't remember the number. And there's a lot of sort of outrage on social media, right? So it still talks about how time and money is still a concept which needs to get developed and which will develop as India goes from a developing economy to a developed economy in the next couple of decades. So that was one of the learnings, I would say, on the company front, on the pivot and how do you iterate much faster. And that was a good learning which we had. So that is one aspect, I would say. In terms of macro, I would say that, the factors around the metal manufacturing space, for example, there's been a lot of compliance challenges which people have had with metal scrap, customers wanting to get more clarity on the GST compliance, on whether the scrap is moving from a credible source to a credible source. And that has been a challenge which we have been able to address by a couple of measures. One is putting governance at the core of our company, making sure we have very, very strong measures across our entire accounting and finance practice.
Right.
So that's one. And the other is, we recently launched a vehicle tracking system. Because a lot of times people in their e-way bill documents, sometimes in the industry have claimed the goods to move from place A to place B, but in reality it has not moved.
Okay.
And that was an insight which we got from some of the steel players. And then we said, let's solve it by putting real-time vehicle tracking. So people can see now where the vehicles are moving from and get a lot of comfort around it. So that's, I think, been on the macro side. On the personal side, I think as the company scales, right, and we have been growing, fortunately, 2x year on year, one realization is that as a founder, you are needing to change and evolve every year.
Right.
Because the team you are handling, the team you are managing, earlier it was a small team in one location, now there are multiple locations, team of almost 100 people. So, the way you think about it and the way you deal with different situations change. What is your focus? What is your one thing, right? Like, what is the one thing you need to solve for in that day, in that month, in that quarter changes. And just making sure that you are agile enough to change yourself, because that is critical if you are wanting to evolve your company at a pace
Right.
which is going to grow 2x. So I think that's been the biggest learning and insight which I have had. Yeah.
Right. And just touching in terms of, because since it's rapid growth as well, so touching in terms of, let's say, the team members as well, and how have you faced, have you faced any challenges on that front in terms of hiring and whatnot?
Sure. At the end of the day, any startup or service company is as good as its people.
Yeah.
And while initially we started off with myself and Akash, we have been very fortunate to have key folks join us in this journey. Ankan joined us to lead technology a few years back. Post that, we have had folks join us to lead certain functions in business and finance, like Sachin, Prateek, who have been incredible team members in this journey. And apart from that, in terms of hiring, I think it's a full-time challenge, right? And I was, on hearing this podcast by the founder of Kayak, which is the legendary online travel aggregator. And he said, for a founder, you're always hiring. And that is absolutely true. So you're always recruiting, always hiring, because you are looking at getting the best people at each position. And sometimes you might just find a person who is so good at a particular thing that it gives you a way to sort of actually expand your business, even though that position might not be there in your company as of now. So that's been the second thing. And in terms of the way we have built is, it's a very different combination of folks. Though we are headquartered in Calcutta, I would think at least 60-70% of our leadership team has never lived in Calcutta or lived less than 5 years in Calcutta. A third of the team actually has flown in from different cities and now made Calcutta their home. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is we are very active across both undergrad and MBA colleges. So we work with a bunch of engineering colleges, Jadavpur in Calcutta, IIT Kharagpur, SRM, Xavier's College in Calcutta. Then we work with a bunch of postgrad colleges as well, some of the newer IIMs as well. So it's been a combination of efforts across finding the diversity, so that you get the best crew, get the mix of experience in freshers. And so that's sort of been, and I think the hiring playbook, like companies scale playbook, keeps evolving. And that's something, it's every day going in, figuring out what's the best for the company and keeping on building on it.
Right, yeah. I think hiring is a key piece, and I think founders should sort of, and be in the mindset of always keep hiring and keep looking out for new talent, right? And coming to, so at Orion, we have always been bullish about B2B sector, marketplaces and enablers. And we also see that about 300 billion of GMV by 2030 is going to be driven in the B2B space, right? And there has to be a lot of disruption which is coming in, right? And we have seen in the last decade, be it in procurement, be it in discovery, be it in solving for credit, we have seen the likes of Zetwork, Off Business, right? And a few others, right, in this space, right? And we see, you see the global macro shifts as well, right? Manufacturing, in terms of manufacturing, moving from China to India and the China Plus One strategy, right? So if, let's say, you want to start off again in some, not now purchase, but let's say some other segment in the B2B space, where would you start and where would you look at?
So I think this was an interesting question when you just asked me before we started the recording. And it's never thought of it, because you all never think of it because you're so all in with respect to now purchase that you sort of, in a way, have blinders on in some way. And but yeah, if I have to think about what could be a space to start with. So I think the couple of trends which I see are very interesting. So I see there's a trend around cross-border and contract manufacturing. So I would see how these two can be married in the industrial space. So there are still a lot of industrial categories in chemicals, in other aggregate materials, in other requirements for the larger industrial chain, which people don't talk about these products, but they are being used as some kind of raw material in the chain. So how can you marry contract manufacturing and then build a export heavy business? And if you can crack that, eventually what might happen is that you would zero down on few products which would come out of this contract manufacturing, and that contract manufacturing products which come out might become possible private labels,
Right.
which you create, and then eventually do sort of like a house of brands for industrial products. So it's a combination of, say, contract manufacturing cross border with a brand layer. So I think that would be very interesting because it sort of marries three key sort of margin levers, if I would say, which is manufacturing, exports, and branding. So if you do that, you could sort of really drive up your margin potential in a business and see. But having said that, now that I think of this, I think there's some thoughts from this which I could take back and build
Yeah.
into numbers of now
Correct.
purchase.
So I think we have been discussing it a long time, and we have been looking at a lot of such contract manufacturing plays, cross-border as well, right? High margin businesses and how they can be built and add value from India to, let's say, cross-border. It's an interesting piece, and we have a thesis as well on it. And as we talked about, maybe Now Purchase builds in this segment as well. So coming to, let's say, now we know a few sectors, right? If, let's say, Naman is building Now Purchase, let's say 10 years before, 5 years before, right? What advice would you give to your younger self, or maybe new entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs who are wanting to start in the B2B space?
Sure. So, firstly, B2B space, unlike the B2C space, is absolutely zero glamour. It's all sleeves rolled up. You are doing the grunt work on day one. So, something to be ready for is actually getting your mind and space for that, because you don't want to be building for the wrong reasons, right? Because all of these things which you see at the later front, which might be some press releases or some investors, and
Yeah.
we recording this podcast is a very, 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 very small, minuscule part of it.
Correct.
And that comes at the very later stage. So firstly, just being ready for that at least a decade-long journey, that yes, this will take 10 years to build an outcome which is going to be valuable for all stakeholders. So I think that is the number one thing I would say for anyone, whether they're building in B2B or not. But in B2B, it sometimes becomes even more important.
Right.
So that is, I think, the number one thing. Number two thing, I think, unlike B2C space, where you can, come up with your own life's challenges or problems, in B2B, that does not happen really often. So you have to really sort of spend time, either come up with some experience, like, so, you might be working at a factory or working in an industrial business and you might come up with it, or you might have some experience. So like for me, while I did not directly work at a manufacturing play, our family business is into SME, into engineering exports. So that sort of gave me some lens on it, and coupled with other experiences sort of got us to sort of get back to building Now Purchase. So I think that is the second aspect. So what do you get as your insight? How do you get your insight? Because you're not there if you're not in the workforce, you're just out of college, how do you sort of get that insight? So I would say that is the second aspect, I would say. And third is, like, we already mentioned during this, is that what is the value addition?
Yep.
And that value addition eventually translates to some form of margin and working capital, which is better than industry.
Yeah.
Because if the value addition is not there, there's no moat, there is no margins, there's no working capital control. So eventually the business does not become great. So I think those are the 2-3 things which, even if I have to introspect and think that what we can keep on improving, would be the same. And someone starting up in this space, I think, I hope this is something they'll find valuable.
Right. Yeah, I think we look at all of this the same. You identify the right set of problems with key insights, and then how you add value, and of course then you can make a business on top of that, right? So yeah, that's great chatting with you, Naman. I think that's it for today, and thank you. We had a great time recording, and all the best to you and Now Purchase.
No, thanks a lot,
Thanks.
sir. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.